November 1944, Eastern France, the Vosges Mountains. The fog came down heavy that morning, thick enough to choke the light before it reached the forest floor. Corporal James Tennant crouched behind a shattered stone wall, his rifle cold against his palms, watching the road below. Somewhere in that grey soup, a German Panzer IV sat idling. He could hear it, the low growl of the engine, the creak of its tracks shifting weight, but he couldn't see it. 300 yards downhill, his platoon was pinned. Tennant was a mechanic by trade, drafted out of Detroit in early '43. He'd spent 2 years keeping half-tracks running, replacing fuel pumps, rewiring ignition systems, and jury-rigging carburetors with whatever scrap he could find. He wasn't supposed to be here. His unit had been overrun 2 days prior during a German counter-offensive. Now he was attached to a rifle company that had lost its anti-tank support in the same attack. They had rifles, they had grenades, they had nothing that could stop armor. The Panzer fired. The concussion rolled up the hillside like a physical thing, pressing against Tennant's chest. Below, someone screamed. The scream cut off. Tennant closed his eyes and counted to 5, forcing his breathing to slow. When he opened them, the fog had shifted just enough to reveal the tank's silhouette. 30 tons of sloped steel, its long-barreled 75mm gun sweeping left to right. Sergeant Calloway appeared beside him, moving low. His face was pale, streaked with mud and something darker. "We can't stay here," Calloway said quietly. "If that thing comes up this road, we're done." Tennant nodded. He'd seen what happened when infantry tried to fight tanks without proper weapons. In Normandy, he'd watched a squad throw grenades at a Panther. The explosions had bounced off the hull like firecrackers. The tank had turned its machine gun on them and erased them in seconds. "What do we have?" Tennant asked. "M1 Garands, 2 bars, maybe 20 Mark II grenades." Calloway's voice was flat. "That's it." Tennant looked down at his belt. 3 grenades hung there, each one a smooth pineapple of segmented cast iron. The Mark II fragmentation grenade, standard issue, 4 to 5 second fuse, designed to kill infantry, not pierce armor. The explosive charge inside was black powder and TNT, just enough to shatter the casing into lethal fragments. Against flesh, it was devastating. Against tank armor, it was useless. But Tennant wasn't thinking about the explosive. He was thinking about the fuse. The problem wasn't the grenade's power. The problem was time. 4 seconds was an eternity in combat. Throw a grenade at a moving tank, and the crew had time to see it, time to react, time to button up or reverse, or simply let it detonate harmlessly against the hull. The fuse was too long. By design, the army wanted grenades that could be thrown back by the enemy, giving American soldiers a fighting chance if their own ordnance was returned. But what if the fuse was shorter? What if there was no time to throw it back? Tennant's mind began to turn over the mechanics. The M1 grenade fuse was a simple delay mechanism. A striker spring, held in place by a safety pin. Pull the pin, release the safety lever, and the striker snaps forward, igniting a primer that burns down a column of compressed black powder. When the powder burns through, it detonates the main charge. The delay was controlled by the length of that powder column. Shorten the column, shorten the fuse. It was simple, it was dangerous, and it was completely against regulation. Below, the Panzer fired again. This time Tennant saw the muzzle flash, a brief flare of orange light cutting through the fog. The shell hit something solid. Metal screamed. Tennant heard men shouting, the panicked kind of shouting that came right before silence. Calloway was staring at him. "You thinking something?" the sergeant asked. Tennant looked at the grenades on his belt, then at the road, then back at Calloway. "Maybe," he said, "but it's stupid. Stupid's all we got left." Tennant unslung his pack and pulled out a small canvas pouch. Inside were the tools he always carried: wire cutters, a screwdriver, needle-nose pliers, a pocket knife, The knife had a thin, sharp blade. He'd used it to strip insulation off electrical wire, to pry open fuel caps, to scrape carbon buildup off spark plugs. Now he was going to use it to crack open a grenade. The first time Tennant had seen a grenade fail to stop a tank, it hadn't even been in combat. Training exercises. Fort Benning, Georgia, summer of 1943. The instructors had brought in a captured German half-track, battered and stripped of its weapons, and told the recruits to practice throwing grenades at it. The idea was to simulate attacking an armored vehicle. Most of the men treated it like a game, lobbing grenades with exaggerated wind-ups, laughing when they bounced off the sloped metal hull. Tennant had watched the detonations carefully. Each grenade went off with a sharp crack, sending fragments skittering across the hull in bright streaks. But the armor didn't care. The explosions were too dispersed, the fragments too small, the force too scattered. The half-track sat there afterward, scorched and dented, but intact. One of the instructors, a grizzled master sergeant with a Purple Heart ribbon, had walked over to the smoking vehicle and patted its flank like it was a loyal dog. "Lesson here," he'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Grenades don't kill tanks. Anti-tank mines kill tanks. Bazooka rockets kill tanks. Artillery kills tanks. You run." The men had laughed nervously. Tennant hadn't, because he'd seen something the others missed. One grenade had landed directly on the engine deck, in the seam between two armor plates. When it detonated, the blast had forced smoke and fragments down into the gap. Tennant had climbed up afterward, when no one was watching, and looked. The wiring harness underneath was shredded. The fuel line was cracked. If that grenade had gone off 1 second earlier, if it had detonated right at the moment of contact, it might have done real damage. But it hadn't, because the fuse was too long. Now, crouched behind that stone wall in the Vosges, Tennant pulled the first grenade from his belt and set it on a flat rock. The fog was thinning, which meant visibility was improving, which meant the Panzer would start moving soon. He didn't have much time. Calloway watched him with the wary expression of a man who'd seen too many bad ideas. "What are you doing?" "Modifying the fuse," Tennant said quietly. He worked the tip of his knife under the fuse assembly's base ring, a thin metal collar that held the mechanism in place. "Standard delay is 4 to 5 seconds. I'm going to cut it down to 1, maybe less." "You're going to what?" "Make it detonate faster." Calloway stared at him. "Jesus Christ, Tennant, you'll blow your own hand off." "Not if I'm careful." "Careful doesn't mean a damn thing with explosives." Tennant didn't argue. Calloway was right. What he was about to do violated every safety protocol the army had drilled into him. Tampering with ordnance was a court-martial offense. Shortening a fuse turned a weapon into a gamble. If the delay was too short, the grenade would detonate in mid-air, or worse, in his hand. If it was too long, nothing changed. But Tennant had spent 2 years taking apart engines that weren't supposed to be field repairable. He'd rewired radios with parts scavenged from bombed-out trucks. He'd fabricated bolts on a hand-crank lathe because supply couldn't get them the real ones. Improvisation wasn't just a skill, it was survival. He twisted the base ring carefully, feeling the threads catch. The fuse assembly came loose. Inside, he could see the striker mechanism, a small spring, a primer cap, and beneath it, the powder delay column. It looked like a thin tube of compressed black powder, no thicker than a pencil lead. Tennant used the edge of his knife to scrape away the top layer of powder, reducing the column by roughly 2/3. He worked slowly, his hands steady despite the cold and the adrenaline. Too much, and the grenade would be a suicide device. Too little, and it wouldn't matter. When he was finished, he reassembled the fuse and tested the safety lever. It clicked back into place. The pin slid home. Calloway leaned closer, his voice low. "You really think that'll work?" "I think it'll detonate faster," Tennant said. "Fast enough that a tank crew won't have time to react. Fast enough that it'll go off right on the hull, instead of bouncing off and exploding in the dirt. And if it goes off in your hand, Tennant looked at him, then you'll have one less mechanic to worry about. He modified 2 more grenades the same way, working quickly now. His fingers were numb, his shoulders tight with tension. The Panzer's engine note changed. It was moving. Tennant had learned the truth about grenades from a man named Kowalski. Private First Class Anton Kowalski had been a demolitionist before the war, working in Pennsylvania coal mines, setting charges to break up rock formations. He understood explosives the way Tennant understood engines, not from a manual, but from years of hands-on work. They'd met in a motor pool outside St. Lo 2 weeks after D-Day and spent a night drinking liberated wine and talking about the mechanics of destruction. Kowalski had been the one to explain why fragmentation grenades didn't work against armor. "It's all about concentration," he'd said, gesturing with his tin cup. "You take a grenade, right? It's got maybe 2 ounces of explosive. When it goes off, that energy spreads out in all directions, 360 degrees. Most of it gets wasted in the air. The fragments. They're lethal against flesh, but they just scratch steel." "So what kills a tank?" Tennant had asked. "Shaped charges, focused energy. You take that same explosive and direct it, compress it, force it into a single point, then it can punch through armor." Kowalski had leaned back, his face flushed from the wine. "But a grenade's too dumb. It just blows up and hopes for the best." "What if you made it smarter?" Kowalski had laughed. "You'd need a different fuse, something that detonates on contact, not on a timer. Military's got those. They're called impact fuses, but they don't put them on hand grenades. Too dangerous. One bad throw, one bump, and boom, you're gone." Tennant had filed that conversation away. At the time, it had been theoretical, interesting, but useless. Now, crouched in the Vosges with 3 modified grenades on the rock beside him, it felt prophetic. He couldn't create an impact fuse. He didn't have the materials, the tools, or the expertise, but he could create something close. A fuse so short that the grenade would detonate almost instantly after being thrown. If he could land it on the tank's weak points, the engine deck, the turret ring, the vision ports, the explosion might do more than scratch the paint. It might disable the vehicle, might crack a tread, might jam the turret, might force the crew to bail out. It was a long shot, but long shots were all they had. Calloway was watching the road. "It's coming," he said quietly. Tennant looked down through the fog. The Panzer was moving now, grinding its way up the slope. Slow, methodical. The commander's hatch was open, a dark rectangle against the grey armor. Tennant could see the silhouette of a man inside, scanning the hillside with binoculars. "We need to get closer," Tennant said. "How close?" 20 yards. "Maybe less." Calloway's jaw tightened. "That's suicide range." "That's the only range that matters." They moved down the hillside in silence, using the trees and rocks for cover. Tennant carried the 3 modified grenades in his left hand, pins still secure, safety levers pressed tight. His right hand gripped his rifle. Behind them, the rest of the platoon was pulling back, moving quietly through the forest. They didn't know what Tennant was planning. If they did, they'd probably try to stop him. The Panzer's engine grew louder. Tennant could smell it now. Hot metal, diesel exhaust, burned oil. The tank's hull came into view through the trees, a low, angular shape moving with surprising speed for its size. The 75mm gun swiveled left, tracking something Tennant couldn't see. He and Calloway dropped behind a fallen log. The bark was slick with moisture, cold against Tennant's chest. He set the grenades down carefully, then pulled his knife and checked the fuse on the first one. The powder column looked intact. The threads were tight. Calloway gripped his shoulder. "Last chance to back out." Tennant shook his head. "If we don't stop this thing, it's going to roll over the whole platoon. And if you blow yourself up." "Then I blow myself up." Calloway didn't respond. He just pulled his own grenades and set them beside Tennant's standard fuses. Unmodified insurance, in case Tennant's theory was wrong. The Panzer was 30 yards away now. 25. Its tracks tore through the underbrush, splintering saplings, crushing stones. The commander was still visible in the hatch, scanning with his binoculars. He hadn't seen them yet. Tennant pulled the pin on the first modified grenade. The safety lever pressed hard against his palm. He counted to 3, then stood and hurled it in a single motion, aiming for the rear deck where the engine compartment sat beneath thin armor plating. The grenade arced through the air. Tennant threw himself flat. The explosion came before the grenade hit the ground. The detonation was sharp and immediate, a crack that split the air like lightning striking metal. Tennant felt the concussion through the earth, a brief shockwave that rattled his teeth. He pressed his face into the dirt, arms covering his head, and counted. 1, 2, 3. No secondary explosion. The Panzer's engine was still running. He lifted his head. Smoke poured from the rear deck, thick and black, but the tank was moving. The commander had dropped into the hatch, sealing it. The turret swiveled, searching for the source of the attack. Tennant had seconds before the machine gun opened up. Did it work? Calloway hissed. Don't know. Throw yours! Calloway pulled his pins and hurled both grenades in quick succession. They landed near the tank's left track, detonating 4 seconds later with the standard delay. The explosions were louder than Tennant's, but less focused. Fragments sparked off the hull. The Panzer didn't even slow. Tennant grabbed his second modified grenade. The engine smoke was getting thicker, which meant something was damaged. Maybe a fuel line, maybe a radiator hose. But the tank was still combat effective, still moving, still armed. He pulled the pin and threw. This time he aimed for the turret ring, the narrow gap where the rotating turret met the hull. It was a precision target, maybe 6 inches wide, protected by overlapping plates but vulnerable to blast force if hit directly. The grenade sailed through the fog. Tennant didn't see it land. He only heard the explosion, another sharp crack. Closer this time, almost directly on top of the tank. The sound was different, tighter, more concentrated. The Panzer lurched. Its engine revved hard, then coughed. The turret stopped mid-rotation, jammed. Smoke poured from the commander's hatch, darker now, tinged with orange. Something inside was burning. Tennant stared. It was working. The crew was bailing out. The driver's hatch popped open first. A rectangular panel in the glass's plate. A man in black coveralls tumbled out, coughing, his face smeared with oil. He hit the ground and rolled, then scrambled toward the trees. The commander followed, climbing out of the turret hatch, moving slower. He was older, maybe 40, his uniform singed. He didn't run. He stood beside the tank for a moment, staring at the smoke pouring from his vehicle, then looked up the hillside. His eyes met Tennant's. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then the commander turned and walked away, following his driver into the forest. He didn't look back. The Panzer sat there, engine ticking, smoke billowing. The fire inside was spreading. Tennant could hear it now, a low roar, the sound of fuel igniting. The ammunition would cook off soon. Calloway grabbed his arm. "We need to move, now!" They ran. The first explosion came 30 seconds later, a muffled thump that blew the turret hatch off its hinges and sent it spinning into the trees. The second explosion was bigger, a sharp crack that lifted the entire turret off the hull and dropped it sideways, broken and burning. By then, Tennant and Calloway were 100 yards away, crouched behind a ridgeline with the rest of the platoon. They watched the tank burn in silence. One of the riflemen, a kid from Tennessee named Harris, turned to Tennant. "What the hell did you do?" Tennant didn't answer. He was staring at the last modified grenade in his hand, turning it over slowly. The fuse assembly looked crude in the daylight, scratched and improvised, barely holding together, But it had worked. Calloway was breathing hard, his hands shaking. Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. Tennant. Yeah. You just killed a tank with a goddamn hand grenade. Disabled it. Tennant corrected. The crew did the rest. That's not the point. Calloway looked at him, his face pale. Do you understand what you just did? Tennant shook his head. You just turned every grunt in this army into a tank killer. Word spread faster than Tennant expected. By nightfall, half the battalion knew about the modified grenades. By morning, the story had reached division headquarters. A captain from Ordnance showed up 3 days later, asking questions, taking notes, confiscating the remaining modified grenades for analysis. Tennant thought he was going to be court-martialed. Instead, they promoted him to sergeant and assigned him to a field engineering unit tasked with testing expedient anti-armor devices. The official term, the soldiers just called them Tennant fuses. The tests were conducted behind the lines in a commandeered French farmyard. They brought in captured German vehicles, half-tracks, armored cars, one battered Panzer III, and let Tennant demonstrate his modification process. He showed them how to disassemble the fuse, how to scrape away the powder delay, how to reassemble it without triggering the striker. The ordnance officers watched with a mix of fascination and horror. "This is incredibly dangerous," one of them said. "Yes, sir," Tennant replied. "If a soldier makes a mistake, he'll kill himself." "Yes, sir." "But it works." "Yes, sir." They ran controlled tests, threw modified grenades at stationary targets, measured blast patterns, calculated detonation times. The results were consistent. With a delay of 1 second or less, the grenades detonated almost exactly at the point of impact. The concentrated blast was enough to crack thin armor, rupture fuel tanks, jam turrets, and disable tracks. It wasn't a perfect weapon, it wasn't even a safe weapon, but it gave infantry a fighting chance against armor when nothing else was available. The modifications never made it into official doctrine. The army refused to authorize them, citing safety concerns and liability issues. But the knowledge spread anyway, passed from unit to unit, soldier to soldier, mechanic to mechanic. In the final months of the war, improvised fuse modifications appeared in combat reports from France, Belgium, and Germany. Always described vaguely, always attributed to field expedients. No one ever mentioned Tennant's name. He didn't mind. He'd never wanted recognition. He'd just wanted to stop the tanks. The war ended in May 1945. Tennant returned to Detroit, went back to work as a mechanic, and never spoke publicly about what he'd done in the Vosges. The army never acknowledged the modifications. The official histories never recorded them. The training manuals continued to state, in clear language, that grenades were ineffective against armored vehicles. But in the decades that followed, veterans would occasionally mention them. In letters, in memoirs, in quiet conversations at reunions. They called them impact grenades or contact fuses, or sometimes just the mechanic's trick. They never explained how they worked. They didn't need to, because the soldiers who'd used them, who'd pulled those pins and thrown those grenades and watched tanks burn, they understood. Improvisation wasn't taught. It was learned, in the field, under fire. When regulations failed and supply lines broke and the only thing left was the knowledge that something had to be done, and you were the one who had to do it. Tennant died in 1989 at the age of 68 in a veterans' hospital outside Detroit. His service record listed 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a promotion to technical sergeant. It made no mention of grenades, fuses, or tanks. But in a file cabinet in the National Archives, buried among thousands of after-action reports from the European theatre, there is a single paragraph in a document dated November 1944. It describes an engagement in the Vosges Mountains. It mentions a disabled Panzer IV. It notes, in passing, that the tank was stopped by improvised munitions employed by attached maintenance personnel. No names, no details, no explanation. Just the facts, recorded in fading ink on yellowed paper, filed away and forgotten. And in that silence, in that absence of official recognition, there is a truth that every soldier understands. War is not won by the weapons you are given. It is won by the weapons you create.